Mary Beth, or myself. All our contact information is available on the Realm database, or you can call the church office and get my email or my phone number. Feel free to call me. Rest assured, the discussions between you and your Stephen minister are extremely confidential. You'll meet 1 hour a week at a schedule that you and your Stephen minister decide. You can meet by phone, Zoom, FaceTime, Skype, Google Groups, Microsoft Teams. You get the idea. There will be no in-person visiting at this time. If you think you'd like to become a Stephen minister, please get a hold of me and let me know of your interest. We're going to be having a class pretty soon, so please email me and I'll get you the information you need. Thank you. Have a blessed day.
As we enter into our time of prayer this morning, we are grateful for those who are caring for others, as Dan has shared, and the many ways that we do that in the community and in our world. There are many prayers that we bring to our community this morning. We also know that there are some prayers that you have in your hearts, that you have in your homes, that you have in your friendship groups, that are especially dear to you. And so all of those we also share in this time. We know that we are still especially praying for those who are hospitalized and in extended care and healing at home. And so we continue to pray for the healing and continued recovery of Nathan Thomas, of Charlene Sykes, of Emmylou Schaefer, of Bob Rimstead, of Ken Upchurch, and Carrie Lawrence, and Alice Moffett Starkey, and Mark, and Gunnar, and Kay, and Pam, and Burke, and Jean, and Jessica, and Lulu, and Mark, and Tom, Jim, Bonnie, Riley, Carol, and Matt. Let's take a moment for you to lift up the name of someone who is especially on your heart this morning.
The service door just opened. The service door just opened.
We also have those things in our world that we are especially keeping in our hearts and prayers. We are keeping in our hearts and prayers all of those who are affected by the fires out west, those who are affected by storms in the Gulf, those who are affected by storms off the Atlantic, and those who are affected by natural disasters and those caused by human hands that we may not know. But in our country and around the world, we know that even in this time of COVID-19, people are also struggling to find shelter, to find safety, to find home. We also know as a nation and a world that our number of cases of COVID-19 continue to grow, as do the deaths. And so we are remembering today that we are either close to or have gone beyond 200,000 in our country who have died from COVID. And those are ones who are family members and parents and grandparents and loved ones and dear friends, all beloved children of God who are connected to others, who are mourning and grieving even this day and this hour. We also were reminded, certainly this week and in these last 2 days, of the death, as we talked about in Children's Moment, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her death was during what is now being celebrated these days by our Jewish siblings of Rosh Hashanah. And also during this time, her death happened during Shabbat. There is some tradition of those who die first day of Rosh Hashanah and also any time during Shabbat, that they are referred to as Zadik. And according to Jewish tradition, a person who dies on Rosh Hashanah, or actually during any Shabbat, is a person of great righteousness. Nina Totenberg, who does good research, shares this way, that the Jewish teaching says those who died just before the Jewish New Year are the ones God has held back until the last moment because they were needed most and they were most righteous. And we know all of those who have lost their lives have also those qualities, and the world is not the same without them here. For our time of morning prayer this morning, I'm going to share a few words of reflection from Parker Palmer, who is a writer and also does a lot of collaboration with our friend Carrie Newcomer. And he speaks of when he heard of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. He says, "The first movement of my heart was shock and grief at the loss of a truly great human being. She fought the good fight for basic human rights for all and was loved by people ranging from Antonin Scalia to black rap artists. But my grief was quickly replaced by political calculations that drowned out my instinctive human response. Then a voice rose up saying, 'No, stop. Return to the first movement of your heart and feel the deep humanity of this moment. There will be time for politics, but the seeds of salvation are found allowing yourself to be purely human at a time when that's what matters most.' For yes, there are nearly 200,000 Americans who have died from COVID-19. But first and foremost, each of them is a human loss, deeply and forever felt by family members and friends. And so allow your heart to break, and it will break open, not apart. Let us be grateful for that voice. For loving God, Jesus taught us to pause and about pacing. Help us to remember that as he walked on this earth, it was also in times of unrest and injustice, in complicated political times. But he did not do this in a fury or flurry of anxious activity. He took time and looked in the eyes of those who others hurried by. He helped those who were cast aside so they would know that they were beloved children of God. When his friend Lazarus died, he dropped everything and went there and wept. He took time to pray. He treated time as sacred and embraced moments by praying, teaching, sharing meals, washing the feet of others. So in our time of prayer, may we pause and honor our sacred moments. So may we pause, remembering those or someone close to us whose lives have been lost, and for all those who are loving and missing them. And may we pause for a moment, bringing to our conscious minds those who perhaps we have passed by or places where we are not paying attention, and asking God to help us be more attentive in the week ahead, in our minds, our words, and our actions. And on this day, may we pause to remember and look even around us this day for those who are living the example of those who embrace justice, who embrace mercy, who reach out to others that are being ignored, who are being missed, who are not being attended to, who are being treated differently because of who they are. Help us to know how we can follow their footsteps even this day. And may we know that we are stronger as a community, and that when we join together, we can make the world a more just and peaceful and holy place. And may we be reminded of our connection as we join our voices in the words that Jesus taught us, saying, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen." As we enter into our time of giving this morning, as part of our call to giving, it is first a word of gratitude to all of you that are continuing to share your gifts with this community of faith. If you are doing that by sending checks through the mail or through the donate button on the website or in other ways, you are helping to nurture this community and beyond. One of the places that some of you have contacted us about giving is reminding us that we are part of that larger community. And one of the great gifts of the United Methodist Church is the United Methodist Committee on Relief, or UMCOR. And one of the places they happen to be, is basically wherever there is need in the world. And so we can know that UMCOR is on the ground where there are fires and floods and needs because of epidemics and pandemics. And so, as questions have been asked about how can we give towards UMCOR in this time, if you send a check to the church and you put UMCOR in the memo line, if you would like it for needs in the United States, just put UMCOR-US. If you would like it for international, just put international, and they will make sure that your funds go where they are needed. And so thank you for the many ways that you share your gifts here and how we can also be outside these doors into the world. And with that, let us share in our offertory prayer. Loving God, help us to be stewards of your mercy and grace as these monetary gifts are transformed into active ministry in the world. Amen. We are now blessed to be able to share in a musical reflection by our singers and by Nara on the organ. And following the musical reflection, we will have a lesson from the Gospels that will be shared by video from Jean and Leanna McLean. It is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16.
We're reading from the New International Version of the Bible, Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16.
The parable of the workers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard. I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day?" But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last.
Thank you, Jean and Leanna. I want to be able to say a couple things. First, singers, Brianna, singers, and Nora, that piece was just wonderful, so thank you so much for that. And also, to Jean and Leanna, thank you for reading. Another word to you folks, that it looks like we had a brief internet service interruption. I think it was during Dan's moment about Stephen Ministry. We've worked really hard to make our connections here really good. Think about it like the power going off at your house. There's nothing you can do about that. We're working to make sure that happens minimally. And if that happens, again, just get right back on. And I don't know if there are gremlins in the interwebs world today, but here we are, and I think most of you have connected with us, so we're glad to have you back. I want to tell you a story about my beginning college years. I began in a junior college in Southwest Mississippi, and in one of my classes, it was a science class, the professor said the day before the final exam that our class is at 8. The exam will be at 8. You must be here by 8 o'clock, and if you're not here by 8 o'clock, you won't be allowed to take the exam that day. You'll have to go to the registrar's office and reschedule the exam. Well, I didn't want to do that, so I went home, and I was really concerned about it. But apparently I didn't set the clock correctly, because I woke up the next morning, and it was, for this 8 o'clock class, it was 7:30, and I lived 20 minutes from the school. And so I threw some clothes on and grabbed my books and probably drove in a way that I don't encourage people to drive. And I got there, and the parking lot was not near the building where the classes were, so I had to run there. And I got to the door and walked in, and the professor said, "Nope, it's 8:01. Go to the registrar's office." Well, I don't like to be conspicuous ever, and I'm sure I turned 7 shades of red. And I walked down the hall, and the registrar's office was down there, and I went to the receptionist, and I said, "I was a minute late for the class, and so I'm not able to take the exam, and I need to reschedule it." And she said, "You were a minute late?" I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." And she said, "Only a minute?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Wait a minute." And so she went to the registrar, and the registrar knew me, and he came over, and he said, "So what happened?" And he said, "Jimmy, come with me." Well, side story, I knew the professor, and the registrar were kind of dating. And so I saw we were walking toward the class. I didn't really know what was about to happen. And that whole not being conspicuous thing was especially alive for me at that moment. But he knocked on the door, and she came to the door, and they had a chat. And finally, she walked over. I have no idea what was going on between them. I'm not sure I want to know what was going on between them at that moment, but she walked over to me, and she said, "Come on in." And at that moment, I said, "No, I really don't want any special consideration." And the registrar rolled his eyes and said, "Jimmy, go in and take the test." And that day was one of the days I learned that there are sometimes really special mercies granted to those who don't show up on time, for those who are late to the party. I'd been late before. I told you before in preaching, I know many times about my father's death. It greatly impacted my life. I was 14. He had been sick for 6 years. But after he died, for varieties of reasons, I did not deeply grieve his death. I could guess at the reasons. My mom was super sad. I was a guy, and guys don't cry well. I was young, and I just didn't know what to do. Whatever. What happened was, 20 years later, when I was in my late 30s, I hit what I then called a depression, and I'm more prone now to call it a period of profound grief, in which I re-grieved, or I grieved fully, more fully, the death of my father. The good news was, even though it was 20 years later, there he was waiting for me. And the tears flowed, and the stories came out. So have you ever been deeply late and not sure what that means for you in that whole dance between justice and generosity? Well, this is what that story that Mary Beth and I talked about is about the person who grows the grapes and has people go and gather the grapes and goes through different times of the day and gets more people to come. And then at the end of the day, pays them all the same thing, said to the last group, "Why are you just standing around?" And they said, "Because no one has hired us." So it's interesting, because part of being Christian, part of being a person of faith, is learning to tell a better story. How we tell our stories is everything. And so there are people who see that story, commentators who look at that story and understand that there were those who showed up on time, those who were ready at 9 o'clock when the landowner came by, and they understand that those who were just standing around, maybe they didn't show up on time, maybe they weren't there at 12 or even at 3. And so they got generosity accorded them. There's another way to view that, though, and that is just to listen to the word of the text. When it says, "Why are you standing here?" And they said, "No one has hired us." So there are those commentators who have been in the Middle East and say, even now, there are places where there is a gate near Jerusalem where young Palestinian unemployed men will go. And employees, many of whom are Israeli, will drive by at the beginning of the day and pick them up for work. I saw this in New Orleans after Katrina, and we went down at First Church. We went down for a couple of mission trips, and because I'm not especially gifted with construction, I was the one who got to go to Lowe's and Menards and pick things up. And when I went, I saw in that huge parking lot of the store, Lowe's in particular, I'm remembering, easily 150 to 200 Hispanic young men waiting for work, waiting for a contractor to come by and say, "Come on, I got room for 5. I can use 5 bodies right now." And they waited there all day long, not because they were being idle, but because they had moved to a different country seeking work at a time when work in this region was available. And so this is part of what we ask, is that what does it mean for us to look at this passage and understand that those who arrive late sometimes arrive for very, very different reasons altogether. So as we look at that passage, I remembered David Brooks wrote in his book called Second Mountain, he said, my wife and I now are in a part of a dinner group on Thursday evenings. It's a group hosted by our friends David and Kathy. We have a David and Kathy who connect with our worship service on Sunday morning. I hope they're watching this morning. But this David and Kathy, they live near D.C., and they had a son in school in D.C. And one day the son came home and said, I want to invite my friend over. And they said, well, have him come over for dinner. And when he came over, they found out eventually that often their son's friend went to bed hungry. So they started having him over more. And other friends they reached out to because they discovered there was a community of friends in this school where the kids often went to bed not having eaten. And they said that's not okay. And so this whole thing just grew, and eventually grew until there was a community dinner on Thursday night that David and his wife attend. And he said the first thing that happens when you go to the dinner is somebody just would hug you and welcome you and let them glad you know they're there, let you glad they know you're there. And then he said you have to turn off your cell phone because we're about real-time connection. And then they would go around the table, and everybody there would share something for which they're grateful or something for which had happened to them. One person would say, I got my GED this week. Another person would say, I graduated from beauty school this week. And they would just have so many. And there was a social worker who came, and he said, I've watched this, and I have been in this social work for 50 years, and it reinforces everything I know, that no one is ever saved merely by a program. They are healed by relationship. And there was one young woman, I remember when I read this, she was 21 years old, sitting at table, telling her story. She said, this is the first meal at a table in a home I have had in 11 years. 11 years. She was 10 years old. So when she had her last meal at a table, she showed up late, and the table welcomed her. This passage challenges us to think very carefully about where we are in that whole showing up on time and doing the work well, and where we are in terms of how we are generous with ourselves and with others who show up late. So, fact is, I am late some. I try to be on time, usually do pretty well at it. But theologically, I was kind of late. I was kind of late on the whole question of would I marry people who were divorced. I kind of showed up late on the whole question of how I really understood race relationships, because I had some stuff to work through. Kind of late on that whole question of GLBTQI, because there was a time I was at a very different place from where I am right now. And I could go down a list of so many places where my mind and my heart and my behavior has changed. So when I read this story, there's a part of me that wishes I could have been there at 8 o'clock, at 9 o'clock, when the landowner came by and said, do your work now, but my story is not that. My story says that there were later points in my life when I went, oh, that's where you want me to be. And the generosity said, yeah, that's where I want you to be. So there's, though, a new one right now that's troubling me, where I feel like I'm kind of late. As I mentioned in a sermon a few weeks ago, there's a part of me that can get discouraged kind of quickly. I have seen some things floating around the internet that suggest that this would be a really good time to encourage your pastors because of how hard their job is. I don't really like things like that because I'm not a big fan of pastors complaining about their job. I like this work. I think it is a sacred thing that we get to do. Mary Beth and I are so honored by what we get to share in this congregation. But I will tell you, and I'm going to use her image, that sometimes because of all the things that are popping up right now, all the different moral, social, spiritual, physical challenge with which we're facing, it is like playing a big game of whack-a-mole, if you've played it, where the mole pops up and you're trying to hit it with a hammer and trying to get it, and they just keep popping up in different places. And there's a part of me, and I don't think the pastoral discouragement is fundamentally different. If we feel it, is because we are connected with others who feel that. This is a challenging time. And so, in the midst of that, Friday happened. Friday. Rosh Hashanah and the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Rosh Hashanah, Mary Beth told you, it's the beginning of the High Holy Days. It begins the Jewish New Year, and the Shana Tovah is the greeting that you give your Jewish friends to say, we know that this is the day in which you are celebrating the creation of the world and looking forward to its continuing creation. That the great sound from the horn blows, that the menorah is lit, and you know life is changing and is called to change again. Harvey Fox, who's a Christian theologian who married a woman who was Jewish, said he learned that while Christian theology seems to be, or Christian worship seems to be centered around what we believe, the Jewish spiritual life is gathered around a calendar, and Rosh Hashanah begins it. And then there was Justice Ginsburg, who had stayed in her job so long after she had been dreadfully sick. She was the daughter of Jewish immigrants. And she kind of lost her Judaism at one point because she became discouraged about women being excluded from some parts of it. She retained many connections to the tradition. Her mom loved her a lot. Her dad was a furrier during the Great Depression, and that's when many people weren't buying furs very much. And her mom actually became ill and died right before she graduated. She wanted her daughter to be a teacher. She became not a teacher. She moved toward this legal career. She went to Harvard Law School. She was in the early classes. There were only 9 other women when she was in the Harvard Law School. At that time, professors really called on the women in class, and librarians routinely tried to keep them from coming into the library. And so there was this woman who, in the midst of that discouragement, became one of the very first women for the Harvard Law Review. She would say things like this. She would say, "When will you have enough women on the Supreme Court?" And she would say, "When there are 9. Well, is that right? And she said, "Well, there were 9 men, and that seemed to be okay with people." She would say, when some of her justice colleagues became not really very concerned at a young girl who had been strip searched in a school, she would say they feel that way because they've never been a 13-year-old girl. But this is what she would also say. She said, "I've written many minority opinions." And she said, "You don't write those simply to say you disagree. You write those because you are dreaming about a future that will be different." Shana Tovah indeed. We do not simply say that we are late to the game and therefore it can never be right. We say, Shana Tovah. It's just beginning, and from the strength of that life, we can take some encouragement. So I'm going to close with this story really quickly. There was a man by the name of Rusuddin Buyan. He was from Bangladesh, and he was really a very prominent Air Force officer there, but he was drawn to the American dream, and when he first got here, he wound up working in a mini-mart in Dallas. 10 days after September the 11th, 2001, he was working in that shop, and a white man came in. White man who was all tatted up. His name was Mark Stroman. And Mark came in with a gun, and Rusuddin thought he was being robbed, and so he put the money on the table, and he just said, "Where are you from?" He said, "What?" And his accent betrayed him, and Mark shot him in the face. He had already killed some other people because he was trying to defend a country that he thought needed defending that way. He was eventually arrested, sentenced to death. Rusuddin barely survived. He grew more deeply connected to his own Muslim faith. And as he did, he started understanding something. First, he grew in his understanding of the American dream. He started working in an Olive Garden and grew in management there, and eventually he got hired with a consulting firm in electronics and tech, and was very successful. But he also noticed something else. He started understanding that there was a part of the American life, whereas he had been a part of the culture of dreams in America, there was also another culture of hate and fear that Mark had been associated with, where there's, as in Mark's story, a lot of addiction, a lot of unemployment, a lot of really tough home life. And he actually started an organization to help address the divide that he believed flowed, I think correctly he believed, from some of this deep sense of being aggrieved and not being from a deep sense of connection. So, one of the other things he did, he reached out to Mark, who had found his own faith on death row, and started connecting with him. And he said, I want you to know I am working hard so that you will not be put to death. Now, he was executed, but the day before he was executed, he spoke to him and he said, Mark, I want you to know, this grew from his Muslim faith. Did you hear me? This grew from his Muslim faith that said you show mercy. I want you to know that I forgive you, and I pray to Allah for you. And Mark thanked him. He did one other thing. He went to Mark's daughter, who was finishing a jail term of her own and was also addicted, and he said to her, I want you to know that you have lost a father, but you have gained an uncle. Good people of God, there are two ways of telling this story. There's the way of telling the story that says you show up on time and you do hard work, and that is right to do. And sometimes it's continued to say, and those who don't, forget them. But the Jesus who tells this story says, if you really are those who show up on time, then join with me in loving those who are outside the circle of justice and mercy, and take those grapes of bitterness, or whatever they are, and crush them and turn them into the wine of compassion and love and mercy, because that, good people of God, is gospel. I would invite us now to move into our time of singing our closing hymn together.
When I speak to sing.
good to be together on this day and to share those things in which we know that in a weary world, we are feeling and experiencing love growing in new ways every day. And that is part of what Jimmy was saying, is we are blessed to see that so often within this community of faith and beyond.
And while things are really challenging right now, part of what this story tells us, it tells us that we are part of the story, and the story is not over. And we get a part to be with the God who continues to write it as we write it as well. It is our story to share and to tell. And we do so as we leave this time in peace, praying that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit will be with us all now and forever. Amen.